Black Lives Matter is saying the United States is denying them the right to choose their own government. You know what really undermines Cubans' right to choose their own government? The fact that they haven't held a vote since 1962. They're a communist group, period, end of story, and no responsible person should be associated with it. I have to say, the left's perspective on this is absolutely astonishing, the left in America, because for people who really say that what they want is Denmark or Norway, they have a really tough time simply condemning communism. They have a really rough time saying that these regimes are evil and bad. It took Bernie Sanders a couple of days to comment. When he did comment, he read directly from the Howard Zinn playbook, where he talked about how it was really the United States embargo that was the problem in Cuba. And now you have Black Lives Matter sounding off the movement. Now, let me remind you, Black Lives Matter is a semantically overloaded term. There's some people who, when they say Black Lives Matter, mean the perfectly obvious thing, which is that Black Lives Matter. Just like every life matters, and Black people should not be targeted by the police more than anybody else should be targeted by the police. Right? That's perfectly obvious. But the Black Lives Matter organization, which has raked in tens of millions of dollars and fostered not just protests, but riots in cities around the United States, and is run by open communists, they put out, it's just a garbage organization. It's been a garbage organization since it was founded in the mid-2010s. And its founders are openly Marxist in orientation, meanwhile skimming off the top, presumably, or allegedly, in order to go buy themselves really, really nice houses in Topanga Canyon. So Black Lives Matter, the organization, which, remember, you had corporations donating millions of dollars to. You had people posting black squares in support of the organization, not just the generalized idea, in favor of the organization. This organization is a garbage communist organization. So far, when it comes to world issues, they have supported the Hamas terrorists in the Gaza war, and now they support the communist Cuban regime. And it is telling. Here's what they say. Quote, Black Lives Matter condemns the U.S. federal government's inhumane treatment of Cubans. Now, you may have noticed that the U.S. federal government does not actually run Cuba, and they're not the people arresting YouTube stars or shooting people in the streets. Black Lives Matter condemns the U.S. federal government's inhumane treatment of Cubans and urges it to immediately lift the economic embargo. This cruel and inhumane policy, instituted with the explicit intention of destabilizing the country and undermining Cubans' right to choose their own government, is at the heart of Cuba's current crisis. Since 1962, the United States has forced pain and suffering on the people of Cuba by cutting off food, medicine, and supplies, costing the tiny island nation an estimated $130 billion. So you see, it's all the fault of the United States. Amazing. It's all the fault of the United States, according to Black Lives Matter, because according to Black Lives Matter, the West is always wrong. According to the Black Lives Matter organization, the organization that millions, tens of millions of Americans marched with last year, according to this organization, America is a terrible place and is responsible for all the world's ills. Why would you trust them when it comes to the cops? Why would you trust them when it comes to the systems of power in the United States? Why would you trust them with regard to anything? They're a communist group, period, end of story. And here they are, repeating communist propaganda. My favorite part of this particular paragraph is where they say the United States has been undermining Cuba's right to choose its own government. You know what really undermines Cubans' right to choose their own government? The fact that they haven't held a vote since 1962. They didn't in 1962 either. Okay, so it's been 6 decades since the Cuban Revolution, and the communist regime there has never allowed a free and fair election. And Black Lives Matter is saying the United States is denying them the right to choose their own government because BLM, again, is a garbage organization. I can't say it too many times. Let me reiterate. I'll say it real slowly for those of you who are having a tough time. Black Lives Matter, the organization, is garbage, should be condemned, and no responsible person should be associated with it. BLM continues, without that money, it is harder for Cuba to acquire medical equipment needed to develop its own COVID-19 vaccines and equipment for food production. This comes in spite of the country's strong medical care and history of lending doctors and nurses to disasters around the world. It wouldn't be a complete statement without a bit of propagandizing on behalf of the Cuban healthcare system, which, by the way, is so lacking. The Cuban healthcare system, they couldn't get COVID-19 vaccines into the arms of people in Cuba. Says BLM, the people of Cuba are being punished by the U.S. government because the country has maintained its commitment to sovereignty and self-determination. Yes, nothing says sovereignty and self-determination quite like throwing tens of thousands of people over the years in prison, forcing people to float in jerry-rigged canoes, basically across 100 miles of shark-infested ocean to get to Florida. It sounds like self-determination when you don't allow anybody to vote ever. It really is. It's amazing levels of self-determination here. BLM says, United States leaders have tried to crush this revolution for decades. Instead of international amity, respect, and goodwill, the U.S. government has only instigated suffering for the country's 11 million people, of which 4 million are black and brown. There it is. It's because the U.S. is racist, of course, because everything comes down to racism for Black Lives Matter. Remember, the crossover between the the racial reckoning that we are having via groups like BLM and the full-on Marxist agenda of many of these groups is very heavy indeed. In the same way that critical racial theory is very much connected to the idea that the institutions of capitalism and individual rights have to be torn down. Derek Bell was very clear about this in his own writings. Says Black Lives Matter, Cuba has historically demonstrated solidarity with oppressed people of African descent. Okay, if by that they mean that Cuba has shipped troops to places in Africa to help establish communist regimes there and kill black people in defense of those communist regimes, that would be correct. From protecting black revolutionaries like Assata Shakur through granting her asylum to supporting black liberation struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and South Africa. Unbelievable, but totally believable. Now we look to President Biden to end the embargo, something Barack Obama called for in 2016. This embargo is a blatant human rights violation and it must come to an end. Now, why bother reading the entire BLM statement? Because BLM, the organization, is not dissociated from the generalized Democratic Party. They are not. The Democratic Party still refuses to condemn BLM as an organization. Its leaders still hobnob with BLM. And it is not a coincidence that this administration, the Biden administration, is having an extremely tough time speaking moral words about what is happening in Cuba right now. For example, Jen Psaki was asked yesterday whether the Biden administration would put out a statement condemning communism. Right? Now would seem a good time. Now, the Biden administration has taken the tactic of attempting to minimize what is going on in Cuba. They say that the current Cuban unrest, that the massive protests in the streets are not driven by Cuban communism per se. Instead, they are driven by something else. They are driven by mismanagement, right? It's the mismanagement that's the problem. If the communists were just good managers, then everything would be fine. But the communists are bad managers, and so it's a little bit bad. But it has nothing to do with communism per se. So here is Jen Psaki being asked about condemning communism and shying away from it.
Do you think that people are leaving Cuba because they don't like communism?
I think we've been pretty clear that we think people are leaving Cuba, or not leaving Cuba, or protesting in the streets as well, because they are opposed to the oppression, to the mismanagement of the government in the country. And we certainly support their rights of protest. We support their efforts to speak out against their treatment in Cuba.
I'm noticing a word missing there. Oppression and mismanagement. If it weren't for the oppression and mismanagement, communism, it's a beautiful idea. It just never worked in practice, guys. True communism has never been tried. If only they could just get rid of the oppression and mismanagement, that would solve it. And then she's asked again, like, so are you guys going to put out a statement condemning communism at any point here? It's like, nah.
Well, we hear from the president this week. He said the other day that he would speak out on that. And secondly, is his position still that he feels that the Trump policies were a failure and didn't affect change? Is that still his policy?
Well, again, I would say, one, in terms of whether we hear from him, he says that often, as you know, and what he means is he speaks out publicly nearly every day at events. Sometimes you all ask questions. If there's an update to provide on what we're doing, on what our policies are, certainly he'll provide that. Is there a planned speech or trip? Not at this time.
There's no planned speech or trip. Again, it's amazing how hard a time the left, the squad, even the mainstream Democratic Party has, simply saying communism is evil. And back in the 1960s, the Democratic Party didn't have any problem saying communism was evil. But then something turned, and the sort of soft fellow traveler sensibility that Bernie Sanders carries around with regard to communist regimes has infused large swaths of the Democratic Party. And it's quite awful, and it's quite disgusting. And it demonstrates once again that domestically speaking, the people who believe in the basic tenets of Marxism, which is that the United States is a class struggle, which has never been historically true in the United States. The United States is not about class in the same way that Europe was about class. There are not these sort of hard and fast classes from which people can never move. But the folks who purport to say that this is what America is all about, they are completely unwilling to condemn actual oppression by communists on a global scale. And this does go back to the Cold War, when the left in the United States played footsie with communist regimes throughout the world and refused to condemn them throughout the 70s and 80s particularly. Apparently not very much has changed, which is pretty shocking. By the way, there is a reminder to be had here that Barack Obama and his administration were quite friendly to the Cuban regime. You'll recall that he traveled to Cuba, he hung out with Raul Castro, he held hands with the guy. He went to a baseball game with him, and then he praised the Cuban dictator. So nothing new under the sun.
I said this to President Castro in Cuba. I said, look, you've made great progress in educating young people. Every child in Cuba gets a basic education. That's a huge improvement from where it was. Medical care. You know, The life expectancy of Cubans is equivalent to the United States, despite it being a very poor country, because they have access to healthcare. That's a huge achievement. They should be congratulated.
Oh, well, isn't that amazing? They should be congratulated, the Cubans, for having been dominated by a communist regime for quite a while. Why does the left have such a tough time with this? Why do they have such a tough time condemning an actual communist dictatorship? I think the answer is fairly obvious. They have a lot of sympathy for the ideas that undergird the communist dictatorship. That would be the only rationale for why they are having such a tough time with this one. This is not a hard one. And forget about the sort of policy prescriptions here. The moral statement that communism is a great evil should not be tough. And yet, for a lot of folks, apparently it really, really is. I will say, I think my favorite media take on this over the last couple of days, there's a take from Reuters. Here is the headline, quote, Cuban protests risk exacerbating COVID-19 spike. So we are now back to the 2020 headlines, wherein if you gathered to protest lockdown, you're going to spread COVID. But if you gathered to dance in defense of George Floyd, then you're definitely not going to spread COVID. All I can say is communism is a public health crisis. Just like racism was supposedly a public health crisis, communism in Cuba is much more of a public health crisis than racism in the United States has been for quite a long time. The battle for the culture is heating up. We here at the Daily Wire are making some big moves. So be sure to like, subscribe, ring that bell, because you're not going to want to miss a single moment.